A few years ago, I was doing a full-time master's degree, spending 20 to 30 hours a week running my business, and also training 5 times a week for my first attempt at breaking a 90-minute half marathon. And to be honest, it was quite easy to do all this.
Ooh, you're hard showing off.
Not because I've got some superhuman productivity powers, but because I'd learned some super simple but effective strategies to maximize the time that I had available. And if you're a student athlete struggling with juggling various priorities, then this is the video for you. I'm going to run through 4 things that you can start implementing today that will help you sustain balance, but also high performance. Quick disclaimer, I wasn't technically a student athlete at university as the running I was doing was independent, but I was still running 30 to 40 miles a week, which took up a lot of time, whilst also doing a full-time degree and running a business. And all these tips are things that I personally used to achieve this balance. So tip number 1 is to maximize a lifetime and minimize dead time. So this is a concept I first heard from author Ryan Holiday, who himself got the idea from his mentor Robert Greene. The principle is simple. There are 2 types of time: dead time, where you let things happen, and a lifetime, where you make things happen. And when I was doing my master's, I made it my mission to eliminate dead time as much as possible. Think of all those pockets of time that you just waste waiting for the next thing. So dead time is things like just passively scrolling through your phone when waiting for class or practice to start. What I would do in those moments is micro-studying, where I'd literally sometimes spend just 10 to 20 minutes doing concentrated work, reading through some class PowerPoint slides or just some revision notes that I'd made. A lot of student athletes feel they don't have enough time for their studies, and the reason for this is because they think of studying as this big event where you have to lock yourself into a library booth for a few hours. And yes, that is desirable to do, but when you're short on time, you have to adapt. And just think, throughout the course of an entire week, how much time do you spend just waiting? Like I said, waiting for practice or class to start, waiting for your friends to meet you for lunch or coffee, or waiting your turn to speak with a professor or a member of the coaching staff, or just waiting for the bus. And if you just spend that time waiting, that is dead time. It's lost forever and it's been wasted. You're not getting that back. But all those little snippets of time throughout an entire week often add up to anywhere from like 2 to 5 hours. And if you were to use just half of that to quickly go over some class notes, review some digital flashcards on your phone, or watch a 5-minute YouTube explanation video on something, that adds up to hundreds of extra hours of a lifetime throughout an entire school year. I'll admit at times it's extreme taking this approach, but it's necessary when you're someone who doesn't have the luxury of just worrying about schoolwork and not having to do all the training, matches, and travel that come with being an athlete. Tip number 2 is the 80% rule. So another problem with being a student athlete is that chances are you're a type A person. In other words, very competitive. And this can mean that you suffer from perfectionism. I was the same up until that year of doing my master's, but I knew that I couldn't be a complete 100% perfectionist with all my priorities, because that would have led to burnout with my business, falling behind with schoolwork, and probably then massively increasing my chances of getting injured. So as much as it was initially difficult to do, I had to concede that the best approach for me was to adopt more of an 80% mindset. Now, what I mean by this is doing things up to the point at which you're 80% happy with them. Because once you get to that point, trying to squeeze out that extra 20% takes a much greater disproportionate amount of time and effort. So if you think of writing an essay, you could spend 4 hours getting it to that 80% satisfaction level, but then to get it to a state where you're 100% fully happy with it, it takes another 4 hours. And again, when you're low on time, I'd argue that time is better spent elsewhere on other priorities to just keep those at a decent level too. And so that's what I did. For my undergraduate, I got first because my studies were my only priority and I could devote 100% of my attention to them. But for my master's, a lot of the grades I got were a bit lower. Instead of marks in the 70s, which by the way, if you're from the US, 70 is actually a top mark, believe it or not. Instead of that, I was getting mid 60s. And being an academic perfectionist, this was hard to wrestle with. But as the weeks and months went on, I realized I didn't really give as much about grades because I was still able to train at a high level with my running and also be able to still earn a decent amount through my business. If I tried to go all in on the studies, then I probably would have dropped my running at times and I would have ended up losing out on quite a lot of money. And there wouldn't have even been a guarantee of getting into the 70s with my grades. I could have just gone from a 65 to a 68, which is still technically the same overall grade, a 2-1 or a merit. So sticking to this 80% rule just ensures you still make decent progress on all the priorities that you have. And this goes for the sports side as well. Even if you're not feeling great for a workout, just ease the pressure on yourself by saying, okay, let's do an 80% today. And in doing that, you still get a great workout, but you don't completely exhaust yourself and then have your schoolwork or maybe your part-time job work suffer as a result. So tip number 3 is to engage in deliberate practice. I did a video on this previously, specifically how Cristiano Ronaldo engaged in it to become the world beater that he is, so check that out at the top. But the premise of deliberate practice is simple. It just means that the practice you do is always super focused, intentional, and goal-driven. For a lot of workouts or study sessions, student athletes just coast and they go through the motions. They glide through training without doing exercises with proper form, or they just passively read through a textbook and sometimes copy slides out word for word. You know, this is the opposite of deliberate. That's sloppy and doesn't actually lead to progress. Instead, deliberate practice is about setting clear goals and intentions for every practice or study session. So in sport, what that looks like is making sure that every exercise you do it with perfect form and pace. Anyone can do half-rep push-ups or tricep dips, but it's actually more effective slowing down, using proper form, and doing less of the same exercise. 20 proper form push-ups are like 2 or 3 times more beneficial for muscle adaptation than doing like 50 half ones. And that's just an example to show that sometimes with sport, doing less is better. And if you're doing less, often it means you're spending less time on it. So less time but more benefits, that's a no-brainer if you're doing things properly. And then in your studies, instead of just passively reading through that 15-page chapter and randomly highlighting things, you should set clear reading goals before you dive in. So what I would do every time I read a chapter or research article, I would do the following. I'd write out 3 key goals of what I wanted to get out of this reading. And to do this, I would either read the abstract of a research article, or I would read the objectives or even the summary box that you typically find at the end of a textbook chapter. And based on those snippets of information, I would then write out goals like be able to write a 1-sentence definition for theory ABC, identify 2 practical limitations of this researcher's study, or come up with 1 real-world application of the findings of this study. And what that then led to was my brain being primed to sniff out the most relevant and useful information. And this meant I could somewhat skim read and then only make notes of the most important things, because we've all been there where we just copy something out word for word. Instead, I was focused on getting the stuff that I knew would definitely be able to be used in an essay or an exam answer. And this deliberate approach meant that I could cover chapters or research articles that normally would take me about an hour to do in about half the time. So think about how you can be more deliberate and intentional with every workout and every study session you do. Sometimes just having 2 to 3 key goals or things that you want to get out of that session is more than enough for it to be productive and beneficial. And then tip number 4 is a seriously underrated one. But if you do this, managing everything becomes so much easier. And this is to add lifelines. So a big thing student athletes often really struggle with is everything coming at once. So you've got the big tournament on Sunday afternoon, and you've also got to hand in an assignment on Sunday evening. So what do most people do? They wait to write the assignment on that Sunday evening. And at that point, they're exhausted from that game or match, and they end up having to pull an all-nighter. And they wake up on Monday morning to start another week of just feeling like absolute. To stop this happening, wherever possible, you must set yourself lifelines. And what this is all about is going from being entirely reactive to a lot more proactive in dealing with your various responsibilities. So what this involves is looking ahead of time to see where there are going to be conflicts in schedule and many things all coming together at once, and thinking, how can I buffer or stagger these? So what I would do during my master's is find out as soon as humanly possible, when is every assignment due? And then based on those deadlines, I would set myself a lifeline, which is basically a date in which I would have my assignment ready, which was typically a week before the actual deadline, sometimes even longer. I remember that around Easter time during my master's, I had to go back down to London from Edinburgh to work for 2 weeks. And a deadline for one of these big assignments that I had was at the end of that 2 weeks. So what did I do? I set myself a lifeline of getting that assignment done at the start of those 2 weeks, and I did just that. Did that mean I wrote the best assignment possible? No, but I still got it to that 80% level, and I didn't have any sleepless nights and chronic stress over those 2 weeks when I was working in London, and I wasn't just thinking, oh, when the hell am I going to get the time to even write this assignment? Just because there is a deadline doesn't mean you have to hand in your work on that exact day. That's just the most reactive thing you can do. Honestly, I'm going to rant here, but it would always me off when you heard college students complain about one essay deadline that was coming up, that they were so stressed about it. And these were students who only had like 8 hours of classes a week, and that was it. They didn't even play sport or have a part-time job. You can ease that stress just by being more proactive and setting these lifelines. Put them in your calendar and work towards that date. To master your time as a student athlete, you have to be proactive and show the self-discipline necessary to kill off all these different weights on your shoulders as early as possible. Is this difficult at times? Yes, but that is why most people don't do it. So much of the anxiety of balancing school, sport, and work can easily be avoided if people just got their together. And I don't feel bad for saying that because I did this and I'm not special. I didn't have any support. I didn't get a loan or any help from my parents. I paid for my £9,000 master's tuition upfront in cash and also paid £600 a month for accommodation out of my own back pocket. So my sympathy is quite low on this particular topic. And look, I know school sport can be overwhelming, particularly in the US, but that's what you signed up for. And if you're on a scholarship, you can't actually complain. You're trading your physical services for a free education. That's the deal you signed up to. And unfortunately, it's on you to keep on top of both sides. If you can't handle it, stop the sport and start paying 30 grand a year. So sorry this one turned into a bit of a rant, but apply these 4 tips and you'll be better able to balance all the responsibilities of being a student athlete.